Thank you. Good to see everyone here. I think, Joe, are you on?
Yes.
Okay, so I have Joe Montgomery with me. So my name is Dave Kelly, and I'm from Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, which is a restorative justice organization on the south side of Chicago. And I'm looking at myself, which is kind of frightening. But nonetheless, so we're a restorative justice organization on the south side of Chicago, the back of the yards, Inglewood community. So for all my adult life, I've been doing jail or detention work. So I'm a Catholic priest, and immediately, or before I was ordained, and I've been ordained for 39 years, whatever it has been, I have been working in jails and detention center almost entirely here in Chicago. And in 1984, we began a ministry with the Archdiocese of Chicago called Cultivating, and it was a parish-based jail ministry. And the idea was that those who were incarcerated, those who found themselves in jails or prisons, what they needed most was a sense of community. And so to have an office dedicated to people who are incarcerated downtown or in some office building made no sense. And so the Colby House resided and was a part of a parish on the south side of Chicago in the little village community. And since I was Catholic priest, I was part of that parish. I was a priest there and also worked in the jails and detention center here in Chicago, Cook County Jail, Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, Department of Corrections, IYC, Illinois Youth Centers, and some of the prisons. And I would do, because I was a parish priest and there was the parish is on a gang boundary, I'd do an inordinate amount of funerals, frankly, of young people, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who were caught up in, at that time, in the gang war that was going on between two opposing gangs right there on the boulevard where the church was. And I'd also go into the jails and detention center and meet with young people who were being held for a variety of things. And many young people, as you know, in the United States, we try our children as adults oftentimes. And so those children, though they be only 14 or 15 years old, were sitting in Cook County Juvenile because of their age, but we're looking at adult time. Many of them got, 50, 70 years, life without the possibility of parole. And I'd accompany those families who lost their children either to violence or to mass incarceration, to extreme sentences. In some of those cases, then I would know the community, both sides very well of a particular incident. So if somebody was harmed or hurt in our community, there was oftentimes I would know both the one who was harmed and the one who did the harm. And when I would go to court, I always felt somewhat guilty or didn't know where to place myself because, as you know, our criminal justice system is an adversarial system, and so it poises one person against the other, and lawyers go at it until someone wins and the other person loses. In reality, if you've ever been in those situations, you know that both lose. But some of those cases, where I knew both sides very well. One in particular was a young man, Alberto, was a part of our after-school program in the parish. And he would come to the after-school program every day. We would talk. He was involved in a whole host of things at the parish. And I got a call one day that after he had left the parish, about 5 minutes after he had left, that he had been shot. And so I go to the scene, and from the scene to the hospital. And he'd been shot multiple times. One of them nicked his heart, and so he was in critical condition, had to repair his heart. And so I sat there with the family for days on end, kind of holding vigil, praying, hoping that he would survive. About day 3 or 4, he did get better, got a little bit more strength. The police arrived, as they do with the manila file folder, and they wanted him to identify the person who had shot him. And when they opened the folder, clipped on the corner was a picture of the kid they had in custody. And I recognized that young man, and I knew his family very well. And so the police left, and I stayed around at the hospital for a little bit. And then I left that hospital and went to Cook County Jail, Division 9, which is the maximum security part of the jail. And I visited Wilfredo, the young man who was being held accused of the shooting. And when I came into Division 9, if you've ever been there, but there's a large day room, and he was sitting afar, and I walked into the day room, and he caught sight of me and had that both look of, I knew you were coming, because by then he knew the person he had shot was someone from the parish, somebody I knew. But he also had the look of someone caring face coming to visit him. And in that kind of space of Cook County Jail, anybody that you can, that's familiar to you or that's a caring person is welcomed. And so for a long time, I'd go from the county jail to the hospital, from the hospital room back to the county jail, to the jail cell of Wilfredo. And when I'd leave, Wilfredo, who was in Cook County, he knew that I was going to go to the hospital to visit the person who ultimately would testify against him in court. And when I left Alberto, he knew that I was going to go visit the person who had done him harm. And both kind of understood that, because that's who we were at Colby House at Assumption, the jail ministry program. They understood that we kind of traversed that division of those who were harmed and those who were doing harm. About 2.5, 3 years later, when they finally went to court, I accompanied Alberto and his mom to the court, and we had to sit in a small room adjacent to the courtroom because Alberto was going to be a witness in court and he couldn't hear the testimony of others. And in that small room, we sat, Alberto, his mom, myself, and a young state's attorney comes in to prep Alberto for his testimony. And he kept saying to Alberto, this is what I want you to say. This is how I want you to frame it. This is what I need you to emphasize. He says, because we want to send this young man away for as long as we can. And he said that numerous times. And at one point in time, I just leaned over to Alberto and I said, Alberto, just tell the truth. And this young man, this young state's attorney, gets very angry at me for interfering with his testimony and how he was prepping Alberto. I got a little angry myself, turned a little red, as I do. And ultimately, though, we went to court. And Wilfredo got 27 years in prison. And Alberto and his mom and myself were dismissed, and we went home. And as they went to their apartment, I went to the church. As I sat in my office, I had this kind of sinking feeling that what just happened was wrong. Because during that whole time of 2.5 years from the incident to trial, no one ever asked Alberto or his mom, how are you doing? Is there anything we can do for you? Is there anything we can do to help you get through this trauma of being shot and near death? All the energy, all resources were directed toward Wilfredo and how we could get him, punish him so that he would never, ever do this again. And punish him into the extent where it would be a deterrent to other people. And as I sat there and I thought, certainly we can do better than this. And so in 2002, we had the opportunity to start Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, which is a restorative justice organization. My congregation is the Missionaries of the Precious Blood. That's kind of why the place is called Precious Blood. But we use a restorative justice philosophy as a way to engage both those who have been harmed and those who do the harm, and the community as well. Restorative justice, I presume you know something about it, but restorative justice is a philosophy of relationship. And when there is a crime or a harm, it is looked upon as a violation of that relationship. And so the energy and the work of restorative justice is to seek ways to repair that relationship and hold people accountable to participate in that repair. As in the criminal justice system, when there's a harm done, when there's a crime committed, they say, what was the law that was broken? Who broke it? And then how do we punish them? And restorative justice says, what was the harm? Who was harmed? And how do we repair it? So it really focuses on the victim. It focuses on how we can really repair the harm of that particular person. And in a community like ours, in the Back of the Yards Inglewood community, when there is harm, what we focus on is really repairing that harm and trying to seek ways in which the community can heal, the family and the victim can heal without calling the person who did the harm a menace to society. Holding them accountable, but not isolating them or banishing them from the community. And so that Precious Blood works both inside the jails and detention centers and in the community, and we engage families who have been impacted by violence and incarceration. and we seek new ways to heal as a community. One of those, so we partner with the courts, because I've been in the jails and detention centers for so many years that I know many of the state's attorneys and judges and things like that to some degree. And I advocate for a different way of looking at what we're doing to our young people in particular. That the criminal justice system as it is in the United States, which is very adversarial, very punitive, only does more harm. And there's research that shows that Cook County Jail in itself probably contributes to the lack of public safety rather than causing more safe communities. And so in one particular case, we did a pilot project with one of our judges. And the idea was that young people would be flagged where their cases might be more appropriate for a restorative justice practice rather than a punitive practice of the criminal justice system. And we had a good relationship with the state's attorney and the public defenders and the judge of that particular courtroom. So we set up a protocol in which we would divert in certain cases, or that certain cases where they were adjudicated, found guilty, that those cases would be sentenced in the community rather than by the judge. And so we had a system set up. I would get a fax of a certain case with both the contact information of the person who did the harm and the contact information of the person who was harmed. And then it was our job in the community to reach out and to see if those parties wanted to participate in a restorative justice process rather than criminal justice. One of those particular cases was a young man who was caught for burglarizing a home. And he was locked up, and then he was sent home on electronic monitoring. And he pled out guilty. He admitted his harm almost immediately. Didn't have much of a choice, frankly. But then this case, because the state's attorney flagged this case, that this might be better served in the community rather than the judge sentencing this young man. And so we got this fax. I reached out to Dante, this young man, who was a young African-American on the South Side here, and talked to his mother. He was 17 years old, and made an arrangement to go visit them. And me and my partner, we went to go visit them, the co-keeper in this particular case. And we sat in their small apartment, and we talked a little bit about what restorative justice was and what it would look like. And it's something that he wanted to participate in. And his mother said he did. And then Dante did ultimately say, yeah, I do. And I explained to him, because it's really important for that they know what they're going to be walking into. So I explained to them the peacemaking circle, which is a practice of restorative justice, that we'd be sitting in the same room as a person whose home he burglarized. That in that space, he would be safe. That his mother could be a part of that circle. That the person whose home he burglarized would be there, and his support system, as well as some community members. We would create a community in which we would look at what happened and the harm that was done and really seek ways to repair that harm. And at the same time, engage Dante in making sure that he was participating in that repair, that he was being held accountable, but without calling him a menace or without calling him any other names that would isolate him from our community. And so then he agreed and his mother agreed. And then I went to speak to the person who was harmed. And similarly, I explained restorative justice, what it would look like. And I asked him, as an adult, is this something he wanted to participate in? And he said he did, that he had things that he wanted this young man to really realize and understand. And he didn't say it with any kind of vengeance in his voice. He really wanted this young man to understand the impact of the harm of the burglary, what it did to he and his family. Now, this man, the person whose home was burglarized, was an African-American police officer. So it wasn't the smartest move on Dante's part to burglarize a police officer's home, but nonetheless. And so we made arrangements to come together on a Saturday late morning at Precious Blood here on 51st and Elizabeth. And we gathered. And so Mr. Wallace gathered. He had a support person. Dante came. We went down really and picked up Dante and his mom because they had a little bit of hard time getting here. So we went and got them and brought them. And in that space, we built community. And so in that space was a retired school principal, a coach from the local high school, a man who operated a corner store because he prior had been in circle with us. He was a victim of burglary prior, and he was very, very engaged in wanting to be a part of this whole process. And we had some young people in that space from our center because I didn't want Dante to be the only young person in that circle. And so we gathered. And the first thing we did before we got to the case, as is often was always the case in a restorative justice practice, is before we addressed the issue, we addressed who we were. And so we did multiple rounds of storytelling. And I don't know if you've ever been in a circle, but you sit in a circle, there's a centerpiece, and there's sacred objects in that centerpiece, things that reflect who we are from our community. And you use a talking piece in order to speak. And that talking piece, which could be a sacred rock or a stick or something to that effect, goes around the circle, and only the person who has the talking piece speaks. So it really enables people to complete their thought without being interrupted because they have the talking piece, and then they pass that talking piece. And so we did multiple rounds of storytelling. So I asked them, we have this like a ritual we do. Who's been a mentor to you? Who's been someone in your life who's really taught you well? And Dante said his mom for sure, but also his grandma, who was so critically important to him and his family. And as the talking piece went around, Mr. Wallace said, yeah, my grandmother too was a very critical person in my life. And Mr. Wallace shared that his life kind of was chaotic growing up, but his grandmother was that stabilizing factor, the person he could always count on for being there. And as that talking piece went around, you could see the body language of Mr. Wallace in particular, kind of going from a cross arms kind of, I got something to say attitude to one where he opened arms and really engaged in Dante and really looking at he and his mom. Every time the talking piece went around, Dante apologized for what he did. He was deeply sorry. His mother, who was a strong, wonderful woman, was mortified that Dante did what he did, and was certain that she didn't want him to get off the hook, so to speak, but wanted to communicate how much she loved her son. And that came through every time the talking piece came around. So we did several of those relationship storytelling rounds to understand who we were in that space. And then I asked Mr. Wallace what happened. What was the harm? And he said, you know, the courts keep saying broken windows, certain amount of money damage, stolen computer, certain amount of money damage. He says, I have insurance. I had that paid for the next day. He says, that wasn't the harm. The harm was, and he told the story of he has a 5-year-old son, and his 5-year-old son came up to him after the burglary and said, Daddy, I don't want to live here no more. And he said, I had to send my son, and he had said very emotionally, to my mom, his grandmother, for 5 days before we could work with my son to make that he would feel safe again in his home. And he said with very high emotions, you know, he said, I grew up in a chaotic home that I didn't feel safe in. And I vowed that when I had children and when I had a home, that my children would always feel safe in their home, that they would be protected. And he looked at Dante very directly and he says, that's what you took from me. The promise I made to my children. And of course, Dante's eyes were wide open, taking it all in. And I asked Dante, what happened? How did you do this? What was the situation? And he explained how he burglarized the home. Really, he was a lookout. He was the only one caught. His friends coaxed him into going, and he was on the outside, and he was the lookout for them as they burglarized the home. But he apologized deeply for what he had done. And the rest of the community could weigh in on the impact of that kind of harm in our community. And then I asked Mr. Wallace, what do you need? So in a clinical, in a criminal justice thing, what's the sentence? But what will help you repair the harm? And he said, he looked at all of us and he says, you know what, I don't really need anything. I've got what I needed. I see that Dante really is sorry for what he did. He has a wonderful mother. So I really don't need any more. And then he caught himself and said, wait a minute, I do need something. And he looked at Dante, because Dante during the circle had told how he'd been expelled from school and how he loved to play basketball. And he played for his school team, but he couldn't do that any longer, and how hard that was on him. And he looked at Dante and he says, look, I want you to go back to school. That's what I need. And then he began to talk about Dante and how wonderful of a kid he seemed to be, how wonderful of a mother he seemed to have. And he heaped all this praise on this young man who burglarized his home. And he said, that's what I want as a sentence, that you go back to school. Now, in Chicago, if you've been expelled from a Chicago public school, you don't easily get back into that school. But in Chicago, it's not what you know, it's who you know as well. And so in that space, we had a retired school principal. And she said, I can help him get back in school. And so the sentence, if you will, was that Dante had to go back, get back in school with the help of this retired school principal, that he had to come back to us as a circle and share with us how he was doing. We finished out the circle with the closing ceremony, and we got up to get our things and get ready to leave. And Mr. Wallace walked over to Dante and he says, look, Dante, I'm not just a cop. I'm also a coach at a gym. Let's go hoop it together. And so what happened in that space with Dante became the mentor, or Mr. Wallace became the mentor of Dante. So I've been to court hundreds and hundreds of times, and I have never seen, number one, the victim really being able to share the real harm that was done versus what the court claims is a harm. And certainly I've never seen where the victim becomes the mentor of the young person. Restorative justice focuses on healing and repair of harm, and is high on accountability, but true accountability. We think in the criminal justice system, by sending someone to prison, that's accountability, but it's not. People go to prison, they're being harmed, but they don't take responsibility necessarily for the harm they've done. They just kind of wrap themselves into that sentence that they have to do and try to gut themselves through that. So restorative justice is really about creating spaces and places in our community where relationships can be repaired and the community can begin to heal from all the trauma and hurt in their own lives. So we work with families who have been impacted by violence and incarceration and try to create as best we can these spaces and these places where people can begin to heal as an alternative to the criminal justice system. So what we're working on right now is an effort called Just Peace with some people smarter than I, and we're really working to establish in our own community as a pilot an alternative mechanism by which, when there's harm in our community, rather than calling the police, you call this restorative justice practice. Probably be some sort of a phone number or contact person that when there's something happens, I can call, because what you want is a response. But you oftentimes might not want the police, but they're the only ones that have 911. And so what we're working on is really creating a kind of an effort, an initiative where there's an alternative phone number, alternative response, where restorative justice practice can kick in, where people can actually start to repair the harms and hurts done, and by holding each one another accountable. And it requires for us, of course, to build a strong, and what David Brooks would say, a thick community where relationships are strong. That back in the day, back in the 90s, there was a heat wave in Chicago, and there's research on North Lawndale, which there's North and South Lawndale. South Lawndale is really a little village. North Lawndale, the numbers of those who died in that heat wave were extreme. And South Lawndale, which is only separated by Cermak Street, South Lawndale, similar kind of community in the sense of economic and things like that. They suffered very few deaths to that heat wave. And when they went back to do the research, what they had found was the difference between those two communities was the depth of relationships they had. In South Lawndale, where there were places and spaces where people gathered naturally, and things that brought people together, and they had deep relationships with one another, they checked on one another during that heat wave. In North Lawndale, where people didn't have those spaces and places where they could gather in safety, and where there was more isolation, one neighbor from the other, people didn't check on one another, and the result was people died in their homes because of the heat. And so what restorative justice is really about building up relationships. So we work with families who've lost children to homicide, who have dealt with that kind of trauma. And we sit regularly in these circles. And I had a group of women, almost all women, a couple of men, who met regularly, a Spanish speaking group, because I speak Spanish, and so there was need for a Spanish speaking circle for families who lost children to homicide. And we for a long period of time, we sat in those spaces. But they knew I also went into jails and juvenile detention center. And after a while, they began to ask me about that. At first, they were kind of taken aback by that I would go visit perhaps the person who actually did their child harm or killed them. But because of our relationship, they accepted me for who I was, the authenticity of who I was. And after they began to ask, in particular about juveniles, what they were like. Were they ever remorseful? And of course, I would say, yeah, many of them are. And as they began to ask more and more about it, I invited them to come in to juvenile detention center to sit down with some of these young people. And they quickly dismissed that. They didn't want to do that. But I did the Catholic Mass in there, and these were Catholic women. And so they knew that that was a safe space for them. And so I said, come in for the service, the Mass, and then afterwards we'll sit down with some kids. And that they agreed to do. So we came in, we celebrated Mass, and then afterwards I sat, and I worked with some young people prior because I didn't want these young people to be harmed. And I knew these mothers were good people. They would never really harm these young people. But I was abundantly cautious. And I got young people who could speak Spanish very well, who really could share their innermost thinkings and thoughts in Spanish. And we gathered. And these are young people who were being tried as adults, so they were in for serious cases. And we gathered. And the first thing we did was, as we did with Dante and the police officer, is we did introductions. And when the talking piece came around to the mothers, they wept because their identity had become losing that child to homicide and what that did to them. And the young people's eyes were wide open. And you could see the empathy that were in their eyes. The mothers kind of were guarded, nervous. And as the talking piece went around to the young people, they began to share their stories. And there were stories of I don't know my mom, to my mom's in jail or prison, to my mom's on drugs, or stories of trauma, stories of hurt and pain. And as that talking piece went around and around, you could see the mothers starting to lean in differently. And as we told these stories, the mothers, their tone changed because they saw these young people differently. At the end of the circle, when we got up to pack up, the mothers said to me very clearly, they're not who I thought they were. I thought they were thieves and thugs. I thought they were just delinquents. And yet they're young people who've got harm and hurt and pain in their own lives. They're just kids. That's what happens in those kinds of processes where we can sit and we can build relationships, where I can come to know you, not by your title, not because of how you may look, but because of your story. And in those spaces and places, healing is possible. And so that's precisely what we strive to do here at Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, both inside the jail, where we do drumming circles using djembes, using drums to begin and connect with one another, and then setting the drums aside and really sharing what's going on with our lives, to out here in the community where young people who come home from prison have a space where they come and they can sit and they can talk about what it was like to be in there, what it's like to come home, and how sometimes people don't understand what it's like. So that's the Precious Blood. And so I oftentimes say we're relational first and programmatic second. So we build relationships, and out of those relationships come programs to support our families and our young people. So here we have a workforce development effort where we try to get young people jobs, young and old, because the singular most asked question I get is, Kelly, can you help me get a job? We have housing for those who are coming home from prison, and that's expanding. We have social enterprises where actually people can work here in our wood shop, in our screen printing operation, in our urban garden, urban farm, they tell me, so that they actually can be employed while they're being mentored. And so we do a lot of different things in regards to mental health. We're not clinicians, but we bring in mental health practitioners to help people who are dealing with severe trauma and hurt and pain in their own lives. We have the arts, and anybody that knows me very well, you know it's a pretty slow day in Kelly's life if he's at the art museum. But we have an art gallery, primarily because it's a way of healing. It's a way of storytelling. It's to young people who are victims of trauma. And trauma embeds ourselves in a place in our brain that's not verbal oftentimes. That's why we have nightmares and daymares. And so to share our trauma, oftentimes it has to be in images, not just in words. And so we do a lot of art to allow young people to express themselves, either through a mural or through pottery, or we have a studio where they can do raps and music. ways in which they can speak to their pain and their hurt in a way that's familiar and accessible to them. All these different programs, our case management, our mentoring, our Families Forward, all these programs come because we listened to the needs of those who are coming home from prison. We listen to the needs of the mothers. We listen to the needs of those who are in our community. And so Prestonville, we're in an old school building, second floor of an old school building. Like I said, we have a few other buildings that tend to be housing. And we have a staff of about 25 persons. The persons who make up the majority of our staff are like Joe, who will talk if I ever shut up, who have come from the neighborhood or who they themselves have been incarcerated. They're the case managers, they're the mentors, they're the ones that work with Family Forwards, because as much as I love this work and am committed to this work, I have 40 years of stories, and they're all stories. And Joe and others have actually, can share from their heart. So that's PBMR. That's my part, at least now. And I'm going to throw it over to Joe. And Joe, I hope you can share a little bit about your experience, both in PBMR, but also in our community.
All right, thank you. I'm a mentor at the PBMR Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. I was recently released from prison doing an 8.5-year bid. I did almost nearly 4 years. I just came home last year in October. And what I could say is I tried to hit the ground running. At the center, before I get to that, like, with everything Father Kelly just said,
Oh, you gotta love Zoom. You're breaking up, Joe.
Justice and the practices and things like that. It's a big light in our community right now, because still breaking up.
You're good now.
You're good now.
What I was saying is that I'm sorry.
Go for it.
What I was saying is that it's a big light in our community right now, because we go through a lot of trauma throughout the days, throughout the years, and it's hard to shake those things. A lot of us keep it bottled up, and to be able to have a space where you could clear your mind and hear that others people are going through the same thing you're going through is like a stress reliever. And seeing people in different positions where in life you might see yourself one day is even better, because we, like Father Kelly said, it's a lot of people that's been locked up, incarcerated, but those who choose to come home and be great and not fall victim to what the system has set up for them, they give back by being at the center and showing us kids, us young adults, that it is a different path to take. And during my incarceration, I met a man named Joseph, formerly known as JoJo, and our relationship has started in prison. But me knowing Father Kelly and him knowing Shirley Orlando, another caseworker at Precious Blood, led him to come to Precious Blood upon his release. And then I came home a little while after him, and our relationship deepened, because he noticed while I was in jail that, like, my mind frame was a little different from trying to come home and be on the same things that got me locked up. And me seeing him coming from doing that much time and willing not to be selfish, to come home and just worry about himself, but to put his time and effort to dedicate others and encourage them to be better versions of themselves, really helped me stay on the path that I'm trying to be on as well, in the same aspect of trying to show my little brother and them how to be better, and that the streets is not going to be our success, but we don't also have to let it be our burden. I mean by that, like, don't look at the past as if it was not there. Just reflect on it and try to do better in the future. And then in the present, focus on what you could handle now and worry about the things later. And this type of mindset and framework came from being at Precious Blood, just seeing Father Kelly, Sister Donna, and them have patience enough to work with us because, like I said, like we got a lot of trauma in our community, and we all go through things. So sometimes we come up there with a really bad day. Just to have somebody there for you that's gonna really listen to you and try to help you walk through these steps and make your life a little easier that day and further on is a blessing. So we try not to take too much advantage of that. I know myself personally, I try my best to work towards that goal and to be a better person for the next man, woman, whoever looks at me in any type of aspiration or anything like that. Try to be a leader for my community. And it's hard coming from prison, then trying to do that, knowing that I had so much time taken away from me and being away from my family and things like that, still seeing them struggle and overcome their battles and their demons, to seeing other kids and their families go through the same thing. So like just the restorative justice process period is a gift, and it's not to be taken for granted because it's a lot of hardworking people that dedicated their time and their effort to putting forth this type of like basically legislative in a way to make it what we don't have to depend on jail to teach a person a lesson. Because if you ask me, jail didn't teach me nothing but more crime, hearing other people's crimes and stories, how they got locked up and what they gonna do better this time when they go home as far as crime go. So like it really didn't do nothing in programs, and that wasn't always effective, and it's hard to get in access to. So jail really, I would never say jail is a place that I want anybody to go and to better themselves in a way. You can get yourself together in jail by being isolated, not worrying about taking care of others, but make sure you're yourself straight at the time. Yeah, that's cool, but I would never say jail is a place for anybody to go, and the way they treat you in there is really messed up. But overall, in the center, we we do a lot of things. We do like 5K. We have a lot of programs and a lot of ways to express yourself, and also ways to better yourself with the program, with schooling, tutoring, helping you get in school, and just like knowing that you have a second home is amazing because you don't have to, like, in life you go through things and people are not always there as they say they would be. But knowing that somebody's really there and that you can count on them and they really stand on their word and firm belief, you should never take that for granted. And I won't ever do that. Having Father Kelly with me through my whole incarceration, letters, financially, just emotionally support, picking up the phone, just let me know like that I got a future and I need to uphold it and I need to be a part of something great. And that's what I do at the center. I just became a mentor, and I got some young kids looking up to me and saying, like, wow, you was just gone for a little minute. Now you back and you working, you got yourself a car and stuff like that. You on the right path and you're not doing it illegally. Like that's giving them hope, because that's the same thing that my mentors do for me, give me hope. See that they are still struggling. We all are still struggling in our own little ways, in our own little lives, but that we get up every day and try to do better than yesterday and maintain a positive attitude in the midst of this chaos that we go through every day in the world. It's it's hard, but when you have help and support, it lightens the burden, makes it easier. And that's what Father Kelly and them do at the center. Like they make it easy, and we try to make it easy on them by not coming up there every day hard-headed and disobedient and stuff like that. Just to give them the patience they give us is what I mean by that. Like just come up there ready, determined, and focused, you could get a lot done coming up there to the center. The community, the center is the heart of the community for our community, basically. Like everybody generates through the center. We have cookouts and things in that nature to bring everybody together, basketball tournaments in the summertime, wintertime, we all be inside, ping pong, we used to play pool. We should like, everybody just come up there and just like vibe out, get a sense of everybody. And then the same person you was probably into it with the day before, you hanging out with them, chilling, just making good company because it's a safe space. It's a place where you could be yourself and not be judged for you being you, whether you uniquely challenged or anything like that. Like you could just be yourself and you will not have any problems when nobody look at you different. And then being in a circle, knowing that what you say in a circle could stay in a circle due to confidentiality. Like these things like motivates our community. And I don't know where our community would be right now without the center, Father Kelly and them pushing, fighting for us every day. That's what I want to share.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. The only thing I'll say, and then we can go, you guys, into questions and all that good stuff, is that Joe, because we know each other well, refers to me all the time, but it's really about the Joes in our space and our place that really create the center as a safe environment. You know, that they welcome other people into that space, that Joe becomes the mentor. And so many of our mentors and case managers and program folks come from the community. And so seeing somebody that you know went through some of the stuff that you went through, really reaching out to you and caring about you is impactful. And I think that's what makes Precious Blood really special. It's not because of me. I mean, I'm privileged to be a part of that. I'm privileged to have a space and a place in that. But really, it's what makes Precious Blood so special is when guests come into our space. I get this told to me all the time. The guest comes in and young people will say hello to them. They'll get up and shake their hands. They'll engage them because they truly want Precious Blood to be a space that's safe for everybody, not just for them. And so that's pretty powerful, especially when there's people coming from different walks of life coming in that space. So I will throw it back over to you all, David, and your team for how you want to go with questions and answers.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, David. First of all, thank you. And Joe, thank you for sharing your story and about your work with Precious Blood. And it was good food for my soul to hear these stories this morning. So we have some questions, and actually some of the first questions up there were about sort of how does Precious Blood work with the criminal justice system? You know, how do you interact with that? Is there pushback from attorneys? There's a question also about, is there a way to sort of implement this already at the 911? Is there a level before or as things are immediately occurring? So David Kelly, if you want to sort of reflect a little bit on that, and we can go, and I will let folks unmute themselves and give voice to their questions more directly.
So it depends. It's what I have found is those judges and state's attorneys and police officers, whoever, who know us, understand us a little bit more than those who just have a kind of a bird's eye view, not a bird's eye view, but a distance view of us. So yeah, what we're proposing to the courts is pretty radical in the sense it takes the power away from judges and puts it into the community. And that's hard for judges to grapple with. The real issue, I think every judge that I know, and not every judge, but many of the judges I know, would welcome to send these young people into the community if they believe the community had the wherewithal to really kind of hold them accountable, ensure that they wouldn't do further harm. But the problem with the system is they don't know the community, and they have a view that the community is the problem, not the solution. My view is if real change is ever going to happen, it's got to happen within the community. And somehow we have to get the courts and the systems to see the community as a partner in trying to create safer environments for everybody. Nobody wants a safer community as much as the community, because we live here. And so, but that's not the feeling of the systems. And so I think that's where we have to build stronger relationships with the courts. The other thing I'd say to that is, you get a lot of defund the police. And, while I think that police don't need any more funding, and certainly we could take some of their funding and put it back into the community, because I think that the community is better poised to do certain things and respond in certain ways far better than the police. The police are called for domestic violence issues. Police are called for disturbance on the block. Police are called for my son who has mental health issues, it didn't take his medication, is now tweaking out. And they're not equipped to deal with those kinds of things. There was in the news, there was like a couple months ago that only about 9% of what police respond to is really policing. So much more of what they're responding to is just altercations within the community that are more domestic in relationship, mental health in relationship, those kinds of things. And so I think what we're proposing is not to deconstruct the police, because I'm too old and I don't have enough energy to go down that path, but to construct something as an alternative, so that if I was a community person and my garage got broken into and I knew who that was because it's that little kid next door, I know it is, that they could call someone else, and because of deep relationships with that little kid and that little kid's mom and grandmom and other people on that block, we could respond in a way that, first of all, listens to the victim, to give them their chance to talk about the hurt and pain and disappointment, but also call upon that young person and his mom, who no doubt wants best for him, to be held accountable and to participate in the healing. Way back when, I come from a large family, and I inadvertently threw a stone and broke a window of our neighbor. And I thought I got away with it. My father saw me. So he marched me over, and this is a neighbor that it was not the best of relationships, let's just say that. And he marched me over, and he said that you have to admit to your harm, and we're going to repair the window, pay for the window. And the neighbor came to the door, and while they appreciated my dad taking me over there, they said, "Don't worry about it, we got it. It's not." But my father was insistent that I would have to repair that window. And so what had happened was, he said, David will mow your grass for whatever the period of time, and that will be payment because there's an elderly guy. And so that was my 10th sentence, if you will. But the problem is we didn't have the lawnmower. So I had to go over and borrow the old man's lawnmower. And because I was pretty young, I couldn't get it started. So the old man would have to come out and help me start it. And so as I did all this work, the relationship between me and that old man became a stronger relationship. And, every day and to the point where he then hired me to take care of his lawn long after I repaired repaid for the window. See, that's what can happen in a community in which you are held accountable, but you're not just a menace to society, but rather you're building relationships and repairing relationships at the same time. So that's what we're trying to create in our community, so that we can have an alternative phone number. It really will be something like a phone number or some sort of means to where I can get response right away, because that's what you want. That's why people call the police, because they come, in many neighborhoods, they come right away. But what we want is to come and really respond to some of those kinds of things. So good relationship with some of the courts. I think they appreciate us. I think that they have a hard time seeing a community really taking care of the business. And so giving up some of that power is very difficult for the court system.
Thank you. I know Jacqueline and Jenna had questions earlier. If you want to unmute and give voice to that. Otherwise, I'll open up. I see Ashley Parker has a question as well.
Yeah, I can speak on my question. Well, you kind of touched on it a little bit. I was just asking about more details as to the alternative to the 911 call. You touched on it a little bit there, but well, there's just like certain situations in which I feel like the police are necessary to be involved, like police reports for insurance purposes, or if someone like for violence, if someone's actually harmed and needs to go to the hospital, things like that. So I'm just not sure like if that would be covered or if that would be kind of like a secondary to calling the police, because I feel like there's certain situations in which you need to call the police.
Yeah, I think so. To answer your question, yeah, it may not be for every situation. I hope it's for 90% of the situations. I think though that like we have an outreach team, and this outreach team builds relationships with the young people who are on the corners and the blocks, and the young people that are kind of out there. And so I think they have a better relationship with a lot of those young people in stopping some of the violence that even the police do because of their relationship. So I think it could be called and utilized for a lot more than you think. But yeah, of course, if there is, call the ambulance if there's harm and hurt. But I think there's a lot more that you could do in this means. But no, it wouldn't be for every single thing. I think and I think somebody might have, I didn't look at the chat, but I saw it come through. Schools oftentimes face this kind of same issue where a young person might do something or do some harm within that school. And too often we have police officers in the school, a station in the school, which is something we're working against. But having an alternative for that school is also an important piece where they could rely on the community to be of assistance and be of help in this restorative justice kind of effort, because most teachers want the best for their students. And they don't want to call the police and have somebody criminalized, put in the criminal justice system. And so if they had an alternative, I think that would be their option. But it has to be an alternative that not only responds, but then after the response continues the relationships and responds with resources. Because oftentimes what happened, I need some things. Somebody stole my purse out of my car. Now I can't get in my car. I'm going to miss a day of work. I need somebody to accompany me and walk me through those things, to call the police and get the police report, make sure that's gotten so I get insurance, to get me another key, to take me to work, or whatever the issue might be. That's where a community can come and respond in a real way. Whereas a police in those instances will come, give you a police report and say, okay, thanks, and go, so there's that, the accompaniment part is not there.
Ashley, you had asked about the schools, but you had some other questions there. Would you like to unmute yourself? And
Oh yeah, I'm in the school ed program, a special education major, and I had a question like, what schools do you partner with your program?
So we've partnered with a lot of them. In our neighborhood is Richards Academy, which is on 51st and Laughlin. We've done visitation here in our community, which is on 54th and Green, 55th and Green. We have done schools down south. Tilden High School, which is on 47th and Union, some of those schools. We have trained and given presentations in a number of schools, and we partner with other orgs that do more of that training within schools than we do. But the thing about a school is we have found, unless you get the administration and the principal to buy into this, and it becomes a cultural thing, that this is the way we want to operate as a school, then it doesn't always take root. An example of that is, I trained about 80 some of the juvenile detention center staff years ago. And the idea, when we did a 4-day training, a peacemaking circle training, 4 days, they came to our center to get trained at various times. So we did like 20 at a time. And to a person, they left energized and very optimistic about how they could use this in the work that they did in juvenile detention center. But what happened ultimately was that I could see little by little it kind of waned and it was kind of less and less happening in that regard. And primarily because while they had great intentions and knew how they wanted to use it, the overall culture of the juvenile detention center was punitive. And so it didn't last. We tried to do a program within a culture that was not accepting of the restorative justice practices. So what we found, many of us talk about this, that unless a school is wanting to really change the culture, the environment, and use a different philosophy as they engage their students and staff, that the peacemaking circle really doesn't happen. So restorative justice is a philosophy, and the peacemaking circle is a practice of that philosophy. You can't do the practice if you don't have the philosophy, you don't believe in the philosophy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Mackenzie, I think you have a question.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, how can students at Loyola or the average person support restorative justice in the work you're doing, maybe in our own community around Loyola and obviously beyond where you guys are doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I've encouraged many of our universities to embrace a more restorative justice practice versus oftentimes even our Loyolas of the world can be punitive when things don't go the way they think they ought to go, or there's some things happening on campus or near campus that a student gets in trouble, to use a more restorative justice approach to things because you are a community. And I think there's also work to be done for young people to be trained in peacemaking circles so they can utilize this practice both in their own environments and their own communities, and if they want to participate in some of the things that are happening in communities that are outside your own community. So for the most part, we're trying to train our own members and both the staff and also the community members in practices of restorative justice so they can become the practitioners. But oftentimes there's need for someone outside our community to come in and sit in those spaces as well. So those are all opportunities.
Thanks. Jenna, you have a question?
Hi, yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Father Kelly and Joe, for being here today and sharing your time. And thanks to Curl for putting on these programs. This one in particular, I think, is really wonderful. I'm curious if you can speak to what criteria are used to determine which cases are eligible to go through the RJ process, criminal cases, versus having to go through a traditional court proceeding. And then who, I guess this is a three-part question, who makes that decision? And then what, if any, room for advocacy is there around trying to build up that program?
So the kinds of cases that are appropriate are when people are willing to engage in a restorative practice. You cannot force someone into a circle or into a restorative justice practice because it just doesn't work. So when I do these pre-circles, if the court says this is a case we think might work, I go to them and I determine whether or not they want to participate. One example is when I went to a kid who the court sent me this kid, and I went to him and I said, "Is this something you want to do?" And he said, "Yeah, I do." And I says, "Well, what are you going to say when you get into that circle to the person whose home you, I think it was a burglary as well." And he looked at me and he says, "I really didn't do it." I says, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You pled guilty, didn't you?" And he says, "Yeah, I did." He says, "I couldn't keep going back and forth to court all those times. So I just decided that I would do this and plead guilty and just get it over with." So we couldn't do a circle in that particular case because I wasn't going to have that young person come in and say I did something he didn't do. And I certainly wasn't going to come in to have the victim hear that the person we had in that space didn't do it. And, it wouldn't suit any purpose. So those kinds of cases are not appropriate. If someone is unwilling to be a part of that, then it's, maybe they can't, but then that's not appropriate. And you always got to say, can I create a safe environment? Can I, can this environment be safe enough? And that's some of the criteria. And now I forgot the other part of your questions. Age,
Oh, that's okay. That's really helpful. And I think the last part was like, what room, if there's specifically within the courts, right? Like, how is that determination made to even say, hey, PBMR, this is a case y'all might want to work with in terms of RJ? And then what can folks that are passionate and committed to this work do to further that, to grow that program?
Right. So the persons who are the gatekeepers in a lot of this is the state's attorney. State's attorney are the ones that file the cases. They determine whether or not this is going to be this kind of a case or what level of crime it's going to be charged with. And so that they have a great deal of leeway in how they charge. So they are the ones that oftentimes we work with who can say this would be better served in a community. They have to be knowledgeable of restorative justice and trust the restorative justice practitioners. The judge has to go along with it, of course, but oftentimes the judge goes along with if the state's attorney, the public defender, or the defense attorney can come to an agreement. Oftentimes the judge will go along with it, but they have to also agree with the restorative practices. The real issue is really the defense attorneys. So in this particular case, pilot project I did with a particular court, this was years ago, we did a presentation in the courts, and it was the public defenders who were vehemently against peacemaking circles. And the reason they were vehemently against peacemaking circles is because they didn't want their client, quote unquote, to go into a space where they weren't and potentially say something that would open them up to further prosecution. So they would not allow their clients to go to any kind of peacemaking circles because they didn't think it was, they feared for what might come out of that peacemaking circle. So what we're working on legislatively, and let me tell you, I'm not really one of those, I don't deal with Springfield a lot, but what we're pushing, and we have we proposed it, is privilege for circles. In other words, what is said in circles is considered privilege or confidential, privilege like a lawyer and a client has, as it is in mediation. So that in defense attorneys told me, if you get that, if that happens, then we most certainly will support this. And so it's that whole component that is really a stumbling block, if you will. Also, as I said before, for the most part, courts don't trust communities. And so you have to somehow help that court understand that the community is serious about the work that they're doing.
Thank you. Grace, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how many courts or courtrooms in Chicago currently work with precious blood to refer cases and use restorative justice.
So not as many as I want, and none of them wholesale. In other words, I don't have any court that says, any case you want, you can have, Kelly. But what we do is we advocate for certain cases. So if it's a young man who that we know is from our community, then we'll go and advocate for different kinds of means. And if nothing else, we just show up in court and we support that person. But if it's possible, we advocate for a circle. We had a case not that long ago where a young man inadvertently, because of drinking, killed his friend. They had an accident. And we partnered with other folks to create spaces and circles where people could come together. And because of that, the judge gave the minimum, the far minimum, because of the restorative justice work we were doing. So it's case by case right now, because there's no mechanism for us to do it wholesale. I don't know if you've heard about the restorative justice community courts. They're in Lawndale, North Lawndale. They've opened some others. That's a little different than what I'm talking about, because I don't think a court can be restorative. So I think it's because by definition, a court is hierarchical. It's the judge makes the decision. And I've seen in those kinds of spaces, and I got to be careful what I say because I believe so wholeheartedly in restorative justice. But I think that what I'm talking about and the efforts that I'm trying to do is community-based, where community itself is really, there's community development to where we can actually take on these cases ourselves and hold our young person accountable. If you think of the person who you feel has the most authority in your life, my guess, it's not the local police officer. My guess, it's a family member who really is the one in your world that has the most authority. And utilizing that in these kinds of situations with support and care and the mechanism is what we're striving to do.
Thanks. I was going to ask a question about if you had a relationship with the courts in North Lawndale and elsewhere on that. So thank you. Other questions? Anybody want to unmute?
I have a question. I was just curious if you've had any experience doing this work with gender-based violence. I'm not sure if that's within your scope, but just curious about what that would look like.
So we have done some work, but the only time I'll do that work if I have someone who is in that space and works with me who understands some of the underlying issues within that. And so I don't put myself in spaces where I don't really understand completely the dynamics, because the last thing I'd want to do is to help resolve a particular issue if there's some underlying kinds of biases or tendencies or something like that that I wasn't aware of. It's a similar thing for any kind of domestic violence. I've got to be very careful that I don't work out to where people can resolve a particular instance or issue, but there's underlying issues that nobody's tending to. And so I want someone in those spaces who has a little bit more experience in that area to make sure that we follow through and we really deal with some of the underlying issues as well.
Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it is wonderful. It doesn't just sound wonderful. But I'm wondering about, have you and others who are in this space doing this kind of work, talking about how you can institutionalize this within the justice system? Well, I'm not sure it's a justice system, but anyway, within the system, so that, it's more of a normal thing rather than an extra governmental thing.
Yes, certainly we talk about this all the time. One of the things you have to understand is the practice of restorative justice, particularly the peacemaking circle, is an indigenous practice. And so we've got to maintain that deep, deep respect for indigenous folks who didn't create systems in order to deal with some of the issues within their own community. And so to institutionalize something like this, if it's done within, a cultural shift and respectful of the underlying values of the practice, then I think it can become part of a community and the preferred way that we do things in a particular community. But I don't think it can be owned by a system. I think it has to be owned by a community, because it's got to be owned by the relationships we have with one another. And so that's why I say that this is just me, but I feel, and I'm old enough I could just speak my mind, I really think that there is no reform possible of the criminal justice system. I frankly think it's just got to be discarded for a better way. Obviously, we have to build that better way and make that the more prevalent and predominant way that we do things. But the criminal justice system inherently is about adversarial relationships and kind of overwhelming one side or against the other, and not about healing or reconciliation or restorative justice. And so I really am focusing on creating a community that is what I like the word thick community, where what your neighbor, if your neighbor kid gets out of the thing, that you're going to get involved, because you have that kind of relationship with your neighbor's, the kid's parent, to that kind of environment, which I know is a heavy lift, to where we start to begin to take care of one another and to really work out our own issues.
Thanks. Other questions? I've just got a very nuts and bolts question, while others are thinking for a minute here. How many staff, how many volunteers? Just sort of give us a sense of the sort of scope of Precious Blood.
So we have about 26 full-time staff. We have about 4 or 5 part-time staff. They tend to be some of the artists that come and help us do the work, pottery and all that kind of stuff. We have a number of full-time volunteers, 3 or 4. And then we have quite a few volunteers who come and help out as far as tutors. They might help out in the workforce development issue, things like the different components. This is a very relational work. It's not something you can swoop in for an hour a week and have a great impact. You've got to be willing to really to build that relationship. And so that's one of the difficulties of saying, let me come for a couple hours this month. And young people look at you like, and who are you? And that kind of a thing. And so it can work at times, but like we do the juvenile detention center and the Department of Juvenile Justice. So we'll have volunteers go in with us there because it's a different kind of environment. And they come in maybe once a week and they kind of settle into a pod and they can develop those relationships. But for the most part, it's got to be task oriented, or that's kind of the entry point, where let me help you with your homework. And then in that environment, I get to know you. And so, and then there's always staff or someone else who's a part of that as well, around.
Yeah, sort of going back to your own story, it's the fixing the lawnmower, getting the lawnmower started to kind of an angle. Other questions? Joe, I don't want to put you on the spot at all. Thanks again for presenting. If you had any further thoughts or reflections, please feel free to jump in as well.
Thank you, but I'm all right. Great questions everybody asking. Father Kelly, you're doing real good.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Anyone else?
I do have a question. Father Kelly, who do you partner with, other agencies or any other groups or any similar sorts of nonprofits? Like, could you say anything about that?
Oh yeah, I should have said that from the beginning. Yeah, so when we were doing this work, we found that we could only really service the young people that were basically within our community, because there's so much follow-up that has to be done. And it's hard to follow up with somebody who lives on the north side. So we started to develop relationships with other orgs who are in different parts of our city. And so there's now what we call the Restorative Justice Hubs, which is a collaborative of about 7 communities, 7 community organizations, and then some partnering organizations that help us with like data, evaluation, trainings, and things like that, some universities and some other training kind of institutions. And so we have created what we call the Restorative Justice Hub, so that in all these communities like ourselves in Boston and Logan Square, not Logan Square, but Rogers Park, different places like that, where there are some issues going on, that people can get the same kind of things that I'm talking about here within their own community. And what it does then, it's not just the back of the yard speaking, it becomes this multiple communities speaking. So you have a stronger place at the table, if you will, in systems, because you come with a lot more clout, I suppose you might say. And then we partner with a lot of different orgs to do trainings, like we do a lot of trauma trainings, and just the various kinds of different trainings that do. We're part of another violence prevention collaborative, where we do outreach workers, case managers, and what we call Light in the Night, which is kind of community celebrations and things to build a more cohesive community. And so there are, I think, 20 of those organizations in the city. So we do quite a few. I mean, part of our value system is radical hospitality, accompaniment, and relentless engagement of young people and families, but also relentless engagement of stakeholders and systems. So building those relationships is critically important to us and what we strive to do in all cases.
Thanks. Jenna, do you have a question? Heads up, Joe. There's a question from one of the participants for you. Jenna, you want to ask it?
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm monopolizing this this Q&A session, but Joe, I'm wondering if you can tell us what has been the most surprising part of your experience working with PBMR.
The most surprising part of my experience at the center, I want to say, when I first came to the center, I thought I had came through juvenile because of probation, and they told me I had to do community service, I think it was, like, and they like I got to go to Saturday sanctions or something like that, and I didn't know what that was. And then I'm just thinking like I'm gonna have to go clean up somebody building, office, or something like that, or file paperwork. And I just sit in a circle, and Father Kelly like, do you want to go paintball shooting? Well, I just looked around the room. I'm like, I thought I heard him wrong with something, but everybody's like, yeah, let's go paintball shooting, or go-kart racing, or something like that. And I'm like, dang, like they do stuff like this here? Like this what they do, take you paintball shooting, and this my community service, and things like that. Like it's just shocking that knowing like they willing to get us out of our comfort zone, out the neighborhood, to explore Chicago a little more and other places. And that plus going with Sister Donna and them to colleges and just being on campus, walking around that young and just trying to like achieve that type of goal and stuff. Like I think that is what's amazed me the most, like getting me out of everyday routine and putting me in something new that I will actually enjoy.
Joe, I never brought up paintball shooting. That's what you all brought up.
It's more the same thing, but you still took it.
Oh, okay. But you know, that's a good point, because that was a program of probation. The idea was accountability. It was called Saturday Sanction. So you got in trouble, got on probation, and these community organizations, you're supposed to do that. And many of them did sweep the parking lot or clean this or take graffiti off the walls. And I said this to them from the very beginning. I said, we're a restorative justice organization, so it's all about relationship. If we get Saturday Sanction kids coming here, we're going to find out what they want to do and build relationships with them. And the best way to do that with a kid is not sit there and look at them, but go-kart racing or go to hiking or camping or whatever the case might be. And in this case, I guess paintball shooting, which is not my most favorite one, but to build relationships with them. And then they become part of the community. And that is a deterrent more than any punishment there is.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions? That's acceptable as well. Thank you all for joining us today. And Joe and Dave, thank you so much for telling us about the work that you all are doing. And we wish you all the best. And Dave in particular, we'll probably circle back to you and see how Curl and specifically maybe Loyola in general might be more helpful to you in this important work. So
thanks, guys. Thanks
so
everybody.
much.
Take good care. Blessings to you all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.